Emily had quietly worked at the busy downtown restaurant for the past month, following a strict routine and rarely interacting with her colleagues. During a hectic dinner service, a heated moment with a difficult customer became the tipping point. The manager, David, took this opportunity to fire her on the spot, claiming she was bad for business. Emily gathered her belongings in silence, her emotions unreadable, and left without a word. David felt an odd discomfort as she walked out the door, almost as if he had made a grave mistake. The next day, David found himself pale with shock when he discovered who Emily really was. The story begins in a bustling downtown restaurant where Emily, the woman, has been working tirelessly as a waitress for the past month. She has maintained a strict routine, showing up exactly on time for her shifts and leaving promptly when they ended. Despite the chaos of the restaurant, Emily never seemed flustered and always maintained a calm demeanor. The rest of the staff noticed her, but no one really got to know her. The manager, David, has been keeping a close eye on her, particularly because she works with an almost robotic precision and seems unnervingly reserved. David often wondered about her background, but he never asked. He noticed how she never participated in small talk and kept interactions strictly professional. Sometimes he would catch her staring off into space, as if she were lost in deep thought about something important. Emily follows a strict routine, keeps to herself, and often scribbles in a small notebook during her breaks. The other staff had noticed her peculiar behavior, but did not pay it much mind. She would sit by herself in the corner, writing away, seemingly oblivious to the buzzing activity around her. Her disciplined nature set her apart, but it also made her somewhat of an enigma to everyone else in the restaurant. One evening, during the dinner rush, a minor incident with a difficult customer escalates. The customer, an older gentleman, loudly complained about his food being too cold. He waved Emily over and demanded a replacement. Despite Emily calmly trying to resolve the issue, the situation grew tense. The customer became increasingly agitated, drawing attention from other diners. Emily remained composed, but her attempts to defuse the situation seemed to irritate the man further. David, who has been looking for an excuse, uses this as an opportunity to fire her, claiming she is bad for business. "This is unacceptable," David exclaimed, pulling Emily aside. "I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." Emily looked at him for a brief moment, then simply nodded. She quietly gathered her things, without arguing or pleading, and left the restaurant. David felt a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with unease. As Emily walks out into the night, her mind races with thoughts of what she will do next. She had taken the job out of necessity, but it wasn't her dream career. Not even close. The city lights glimmered around her as she walked down the crowded sidewalk. People brushed past her, engrossed in their own lives, unaware of her recent dismissal. Emily took a deep breath and kept moving forward. She heads to a nearby park and sits on a bench, taking out her notebook and starting to write. The park is a small oasis of calm amidst the city's hustle and bustle. The notebook provided a sense of solace for her, a place to pour out her thoughts and frustrations. The night was still, and the cool breeze did little to distract her. She wrote feverishly, losing track of time and her surroundings. A homeless man observes her from a distance and seems to recognize her, but he says nothing. He watches attentively as she scribbles away in her notebook. The man, ragged but sharp-eyed, squints as if trying to remember where he had seen her before. He decides not to approach her for now. Instead, he wraps himself tighter in his coat and continues to observe, curiosity etched in the lines of his weathered face. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, David juggles the chaos of the dinner service while feeling a strange sense of unease about his decision. The energy of the place was usually something he thrived on, but today felt different. Every time the door opened, he glanced up, half expecting Emily to walk back in. The nagging feeling that he had made a terrible mistake gnawed at him, but he couldn't put his finger on why. It didn't take long for one of the regular customers, Mrs. Jenkins, to notice Emily's absence. Sitting at her usual table, she glanced up at David while he was walking by. "Where's that nice woman who always served me?" she queried, her brow furrowing. David, caught off guard, hesitated. "Oh, she's not with us anymore," he replied. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. David shrugged it off, but felt uneasy. David tried to move on with his day, but Mrs. Jenkins's question lingered in his mind long after she had left the restaurant. As he walked through the bustling dining area, a nagging thought kept surfacing. He glanced over to where Emily used to stand, taking orders and writing in her notebook during breaks. The spot felt strangely empty, and he couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling. Something didn't feel right. Over the next few days, David found it increasingly difficult to shake off the nagging feeling that something was awry. No matter how busy he got, the thought of Emily's abrupt departure kept resurfacing. He could hear her calm voice in his mind and see her serene face amidst the chaos. It was as if her presence, or lack thereof, was haunting every corner of the restaurant, making it impossible for him to ignore. Soon, David started to see Emily's face in the crowd. He would spot her straight, dark brown hair, only to realize it was someone else. Odd things began happening around the restaurant as well. Orders mysteriously got mixed up, ingredients ran out unexpectedly, and some of the appliances malfunctioned. Each mishap seemed to amplify his growing agitation, making him snap at staff more frequently. Something wasn't adding up, and it rattled him deeply. As more orders got mixed up and more appliances malfunctioned, David's temper flared. He barked at a sous chef for burning a dish, scowled at waiters for minor mistakes, and even kicked a faulty oven in frustration. The harmonious rhythm of the restaurant seemed out of sync. The absence of Emily's almost robotic reliability unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He began to wonder if firing her had been a huge mistake. Meanwhile, Emily walked into another employment agency, but like the others before, she faced rejection. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't have any positions available that fit your experience," the clerk said apologetically. Emily forced a polite smile and left. Her calm exterior was beginning to crack. She walked down the busy streets, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Each agency visit was a blow, and she was running out of options fast. Though Emily maintained a composed demeanor, the rejection was taking its toll. The tight grip she had on her emotions began to loosen, revealing a layer of frustration underneath. She clenched her fists as she walked and muttered under her breath. Her drop in composure felt like a betrayal to her usual calm self. Each step she took felt heavier, weighed down by the uncertainty of her future and the constant rejections. She returned to the park every evening, finding solace in the familiar bench. Notebook in hand, she continued to write fervently. The homeless man, watching her from his usual spot, noticed her increasing agitation. Emily's scribbles became more intense, her breaths more labored. She didn't notice him, too engrossed in her writing to care about the world around her. But the sense of being watched had begun to filter through. David couldn't shake off the feeling, so he decided to dig a little into Emily's past. Late one night, he sat at his desk scrolling through various online resources. He discovered that she had worked in several high-profile restaurants before mysteriously dropping off the radar. What happened? He wondered aloud, puzzled by the sudden career change. The deeper he dug, the more he felt there was something significant he was missing. David's discoveries about Emily's past left him more curious than ever. She had held positions in prestigious restaurants, which made her sudden appearance and quiet demeanor at his place even more baffling. He couldn't understand why someone with her experience had ended up in his modest establishment. The more he learned, the more he felt compelled to find out what had caused her to leave those high-profile jobs unexpectedly. David's curiosity grew, making him restless. He needed to know more about Emily. Asking around, he approached various staff members in the break room. "Hey, do any of you know anything about Emily?" he inquired. Some shrugged nonchalantly, while others seemed puzzled by his sudden interest. No one had concrete details. Bits and pieces of minor observations were all he could gather, and none provided any real insights. One of the waitresses hesitated, remembering something odd. "You know, she did mumble something strange during a late shift once," she said. David's interest piqued. "What did she say?" he asked. The waitress furrowed her brow, trying to recall. "Something about unfinished business," she finally said. David's mind raced. It wasn't much, but it might be a hint. He thanked her and walked away, deep in thought. While David tried to piece together Emily's mystery, she was busy. Resuming her routine, but with a different determination, Emily started attending community meetings. She distributed flyers, engaging more actively with people. No longer keeping to herself, Emily seemed to have a mission. She made connections and participated in discussions, drawing the attention of local residents who began to recognize her presence and the energy she brought. Emily's actions spoke volumes. Her resolve was unshakable as she tackled every task with focus. She no longer merely attended the meetings. She led portions of them, steering conversations towards collective action. Her interactions, once minimal, were now filled with purpose. She listened, responded, and motivated others to join her cause. The changes didn't go unnoticed. People began to respect her more, sensing a greater mission behind her efforts. One evening at a community meeting, Emily gathered a small group outside the main hall. In hushed tones, she outlined a meticulous plan. Her voice steady, she laid out steps that seemed both strategic and personal. Each member nodded, absorbing their roles with seriousness. Emily's plan was not mere talk, it had depth and direction. The group disbanded with a clear understanding of what needed to be done next. After the meeting, Emily left with purpose. She walked briskly to a nondescript building, looking around to ensure she wasn't followed. Once certain, she took out an old key and unlocked the door. The building was unremarkable on the outside, but it obviously had significance to her. She entered with familiarity, closing the door quietly behind her. The atmosphere inside was charged, as if holding countless secrets. Inside, a man named James waited. His demeanor suggested he wasn't surprised to see her. "You're late," he remarked casually. Emily nodded, unbothered. "Traffic," she replied tersely. They headed to a back room, their footsteps echoing through the quiet space. James seemed to know what was coming next, following her lead. Their actions were methodical, evidence of a well-rehearsed plan. Emily's resolve showed in her every move. Together, Emily and James shuffled through old documents and photographs. Their conversation was coded but tense. "This one connects to the Anderson file," Emily said, passing a worn photograph to James. "And we need to verify the dates here," he responded, marking a document. They worked in sync, their interactions revealing a complex history. The air was thick with unspoken understanding and urgency, every action purposeful. James handed Emily a small package wrapped in plain paper. "All set," he said firmly. Emily nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before she pocketed the package. "I'll handle the rest," she replied, turning to leave. Their exchange was brief, but loaded with meaning. She exited the building with the same determination she had entered, clutching the package tightly. There was no hesitation in her steps. David remained oblivious to Emily's activities, focusing on his restaurant. Yet, he couldn't ignore the sudden drop in business. Regular customers were vanishing. "What's going on?" he asked a waiter. The waiter shrugged, looking equally puzzled. "Regulars aren't showing up like they used to," he replied. David frowned. It was more than just a bad week. Something else was affecting his clientele, and he needed to find out why. David started receiving anonymous letters, each one a cryptic message referencing Emily's firing. "You will regret what you did," one letter said. Another read, "She is more than you know." Each letter unnerved him more. They came without return addresses and in different handwriting styles, making it impossible to trace. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Who was sending these, and what did they know? The anonymous letters disturbed David, but what truly unsettled him was discovering that the restaurant's surveillance footage of Emily's last day had mysteriously vanished. He went to review the tapes, hoping to find something, but the entire day's recording was gone. "What the hell?" he muttered, pacing his office. This could not be a coincidence. Someone had deliberately erased the footage, and it sent chills down his spine. In desperation, David hired a private investigator to follow Emily and uncover her plans. "Find out everything you can about her," he instructed. The investigator, a grizzled man named Mark, nodded and left immediately. David watched him go, feeling a mix of anxiety and relief. This was his last shot at understanding the mystery that Emily had become. His only hope was that Mark could provide answers. Meanwhile, Emily began meeting with influential people in the city. She arranged discreet meetings over coffee or lunch, always choosing quiet venues. Business cards exchanged, firm handshakes, and intense discussions were common. She appeared poised, her demeanor confident. The influential individuals, ranging from entrepreneurs to community leaders, listened intently and left the meetings visibly impressed. Emily was clearly on a mission, and she was gaining valuable allies quickly. Emily's growing list of supporters was diverse. Small business owners, local politicians, community activists, all of them vouched for her without question. "She's got a vision," they would say. Each meeting built a broader network of people invested in her cause. Her actions and words had a compelling effect, leaving no room for doubt. With every new ally, her influence expanded, making her a formidable presence in the city. The support Emily garnered grew steadily, increasing her influence within the city. She started to speak at local events, always drawing large crowds. People were captivated by her message, even though the exact details remained vague. Her confidence inspired those around her, and her network of supporters continued to expand. Each new connection added another layer to her power, making her an increasingly influential figure in the community. As the private investigator followed Emily, he discovered an intricate network of contacts and supporters. Mark took notes on her every move, documenting meetings and conversations. "She's got connections everywhere," he reported back to David. Emily wasn't just meeting people, she was mobilizing them. Her network was vast and growing, each person playing a specific role in her undisclosed mission. The complexity of her plan became increasingly apparent. Mark reported back to David in detail, describing Emily's numerous meetings and the influence she cast over everyone she encountered. "She's not just another person, David," Mark said, shaking his head. "There's something big happening here." The investigator's findings only heightened David's curiosity and paranoia. His need to uncover Emily's true identity grew stronger. Mark's detailed notes were both revealing and unsettling, painting a picture of Emily he hadn't seen before. David grew increasingly paranoid, haunted by Emily's quiet power and determination. He found himself thinking about her constantly, unable to focus on his work. Each piece of information only added to his apprehension. His mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? Why did she hold such sway over influential people? The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly knew about her. One night, David stayed late at the restaurant, sifting through old receipts and employee records. He was desperate for any clue that might explain Emily's true identity. Papers piled up around him as he searched methodically, eyes scanning every line. "There has to be something here," he muttered, frustration mounting. The more he searched, the more elusive the truth seemed. Yet he couldn't stop. He was compelled to find answers. David finally found a snippet linking Emily to major political movements years ago. The information was buried deep within an old news article, mentioning her involvement in various protests and rallies that had once made headlines. "No way," he gasped, staring at the screen in disbelief. This was the same woman he had fired for being bad for business. Shock rippled through him, leaving him even more confused about her true identity. David's curiosity about Emily intensified. He couldn't wrap his mind around how a woman involved in significant political movements wound up working at his restaurant. He pored over the information, finding details about her passionate activism in her younger years. What was she doing here? He mumbled to himself. This discovery only amplified his urge to uncover the complete story behind Emily. He needed to know more, and fast. Emily's plan began to take shape. She organized a large public event intended to draw attention to an undisclosed cause close to her heart. Flyers were printed, speakers were contacted, and permits were obtained. Emily worked tirelessly, coordinating all the details. Her resolute demeanor left no room for doubt. This was her mission. The event's scale promised to capture significant public interest, and she was at the center of it all. David's anxiety spiked when he realized Emily's event was planned for directly across the street from his restaurant. He envisioned the large crowd drawing away his regular customers. "This could ruin us," he muttered, pacing his office. The proximity of the event made it impossible to ignore. He watched as volunteers began setting up stages and tents, the impending impact on his business becoming alarmingly real. Panic slowly set in. On the day of the event, the turnout was massive. People swarmed the streets, overshadowing the usual business at David's restaurant. Lines formed and tents stretched across the entire block. David watched from his window, his heart sinking with every passing minute. The restaurant, typically bustling with customers, felt eerily quiet. The grand scale of the event choked off foot traffic to his establishment, heightening his sense of dread. David stood by the window, his face a mask of worry, as he watched Emily take the stage. She appeared calm and composed, exuding confidence. Her presence was commanding, and she owned the moment. The crowd fell silent, anticipation palpable in the air. David's heart raced as he realized just how influential she had become. Her stage presence was magnetic, drawing everyone's attention away from everything else, including his restaurant. Emily spoke eloquently about justice, equality, and a better society. Her voice was clear and powerful, resonating with the crowd. "We must stand together," she proclaimed, igniting cheers and applause. Each word she uttered seemed to fuel the crowd's enthusiasm. David couldn't take his eyes off her, mesmerized by how she had transformed from a quiet waitress into a riveting public speaker. This was a side of her he hadn't seen. Emily's public address garnered widespread attention and applause from the crowd. News crews began to arrive, capturing the event for evening broadcasts. People in the audience held up signs and cheered her on. "This is incredible," someone in the crowd exclaimed. Emily's speech was powerful and moved everyone present. David's stomach churned as he watched. His anxiety grew, wondering what this newfound attention might mean for his restaurant's future. Back at the restaurant, David's troubles compounded. Technical problems started cropping up. Ovens malfunctioned, and the cash register refused to work. On top of that, customer complaints began piling up. "My food is undercooked," one man grumbled, while a woman muttered about the slow service. David felt the weight of these problems. It was as if everything was falling apart. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily might somehow be behind it. David grew more suspicious of Emily, though he had no concrete proof linking her to the technical problems at his restaurant. Each malfunction, each complaint, felt like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. "Is she doing this?" he wondered aloud. The timing seemed too perfect to be a coincidence, but without evidence, he could only speculate. And that left him feeling powerless and increasingly paranoid. The private investigator kept his distance as he shadowed Emily, snapping photographs secretly. Each click of the camera captured moments of her meetings with high-profile individuals. He sent these photographs to David, one by one. "You have no idea who she's meeting," he said over the phone. The photos showed Emily engaging with business magnates and local politicians. David, staring at the images, felt a growing sense of dread. Back at the restaurant, the tension was palpable. The staff was on edge, and customers sensed the change. Complaints came in waves, with diners expressing dissatisfaction. "My order's wrong again," grumbled a regular. David watched helplessly, feeling the pressure mount. He had fired Emily hoping for a smooth operation, but now everything seemed to be falling apart. Even the kitchen staff appeared unusually frazzled, struggling to keep up with orders. Emily's influence began to spread beyond the small meetings. She started appearing in local newspapers, her name coming up in articles discussing community activism. She moved onto television, speaking confidently on talk shows. "We must focus on collective progress," she declared on one show. Every appearance magnified her presence. David couldn't avoid her. Her face was everywhere, always advocating for her cause, which remained shrouded in mystery. Her public profile grew daily. David found himself overwhelmed by Emily's growing public presence. Each media appearance widened her reach. Customers talked about her, and some even looked at David differently. The whispers among his staff didn't help either. It felt as though Emily was everywhere, and he was losing control. The pressure became almost unbearable, and David realized he needed to confront the situation head-on. The more prominent Emily became, the more uncertain he felt. Desperate for answers, David pored over the private investigator's report. Mark had compiled a detailed account of Emily's movements, listing influential figures and past affiliations. One section grabbed David's attention. Emily had played significant roles in political and social reforms, often working behind the scenes. This cannot be a coincidence, David thought, astonished by her involvement in major changes. The report hinted at her far-reaching impact, but left many questions unanswered. The investigator's report didn't just highlight Emily's extensive influence, it suggested something darker. Mark implied that her firing was not merely unjust, but a deliberate move as part of a larger strategy. "There's something bigger at play here," the report concluded. David's mind raced. Had he been a pawn in someone else's game? The idea that her dismissal was orchestrated troubled him deeply. He realized he needed to understand the full scope. David's panic grew as he absorbed the implications of the report. "What have I done?" he muttered, pacing his office. The thought of confronting Emily became unavoidable. He couldn't continue in ignorance while her influence grew. Summoning his courage, David decided to face her directly. He needed to understand her motives, even if it meant risking a public confrontation. The urgency to uncover the truth outweighed his fears. David spotted Emily at a public meeting and steeled himself for the confrontation. He waited until she was free, then approached her quickly. "Emily," he called out. She turned, her expression unreadable. "I need answers," he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Emily looked at him calmly, unfazed by his urgency. "Everything will become clear in time," she replied, barely audible, before turning away and walking off. Emily's calm, steely gaze left David unsettled. She offered him only a faint smile, betraying nothing of her plans. He stood frozen as Emily walked away, mingling effortlessly with the crowd. David's frustration surged. He had hoped for clarity, but her cryptic response only deepened his confusion. Watching her disappear from view, he felt a mix of anger and desperation. The answers he sought remained elusive, tantalizingly out of reach. Left more confused and frantic after trying to confront Emily, David felt defeated. He returned to his restaurant, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him. Each customer complaint and malfunctioning appliance added to his misery. His mind raced, contemplating the scope of Emily's influence and his own precarious position. The mystery had only deepened, and he felt more powerless than ever to solve it. Emily's shadow loomed large over his every thought. Unable to sleep, David returned to his office late one night. His mind was consumed with thoughts about Emily and the chaos that had ensued since her departure. He flipped on the lights and made his way to his desk. Sitting there was another letter, freshly delivered. His heart pounded as he ripped it open, hoping it might finally give him some answers to the perplexing situation he was caught in. This time, the letter was from Emily herself. Her neat handwriting flowed across the page, and David couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and anticipation. He began reading, hanging on to every word. "Dear David, I imagine you must be quite curious about my recent activities," the letter began. His pulse quickened, a flood of emotions rushing through him: confusion, relief, and a gnawing sense of dread. Emily's letter detailed her true identity, revealing she was an undercover agent for a powerful coalition dedicated to societal reform. She thanked David for providing the final push she needed. "Your decision to fire me was the catalyst," she wrote. Emily went on to describe her extensive work and connections within the coalition, her words leaving David reeling. Her month at the restaurant had been a small but crucial part of her broader mission. Emily's letter described how she had used her month at the restaurant to observe and build connections. Each interaction, every quiet moment spent scribbling in her notebook, had been deliberate. She was mapping out the people and dynamics within the community. Her seemingly mundane job had allowed her to gather invaluable information without raising suspicion. David's mind raced as he began to piece together the true extent of her carefully hidden agenda. Emily continued, "My firing allowed me to fully activate my network without any suspicion." The letter explained that the moment she was let go, she was able to mobilize her resources and contacts freely. David's decision had unwittingly been the trigger she needed to set her plan in full motion. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized how his actions had played directly into Emily's hands. David's hands shook as he read her words. The magnitude of her influence and the unintentional role he had played in her plan became painfully clear. He tried to process the fact that Emily was no ordinary employee, but a key player in a grander scheme. "I never imagined I'd be a part of something so vast," he muttered to himself, feeling a mix of fear and awe. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. David's face turned pale as his eyes widened. The realization was overwhelming. His restaurant had been just a small part of a much larger story. Emily's mission extended far beyond the walls of his business. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to comprehend the bigger picture. His mind raced, connecting all the dots. "What have I gotten myself into?" he whispered, trying to wrap his head around the revelation. Emily's departure was only the beginning of her grand mission. The letter hinted at future actions and broader plans, yet to be realized. "What you witnessed was merely the first step," she wrote, assuring David that the full scope of her mission would soon unfold. Emily's carefully planted seeds would grow into something much larger. David couldn't help but wonder what her ultimate goal was, and how deeply he was entangled in it. David was left grappling with the realization of the greater scope of Emily's mission. He slumped back into his chair, the letter still clutched in his trembling hand. Every interaction, every cryptic hint she left behind now made sense. David had become an unwitting player in an elaborate plan. The overwhelming nature of Emily's mission sank in, leaving David feeling more isolated and vulnerable than he had ever felt before. The true depth of Emily's plans and David's unwitting involvement came to light. His thoughts swirled as he grasped the extent to which Emily had manipulated the situation to suit her needs. "How did I never see this coming?" he asked himself, disbelief mingling with regret. The complexity of her strategy was staggering. As he stared at the letter, he realized that the answers he sought had only led to more questions.